Watching News at Prime, let's bring you this story now. Forestry, Fisheries and Environment Minister Dr. Dion could be removed from his position and replaced by Democratic Alliance spokesperson Willie Aucamp. Now, several reports suggest this might be party leader John Steenhuisen's attempt to return control of the portfolio to pro-hunting interests. Aucamp telling Newzroom Afrika that he is unable to comment at this stage as the party has not yet communicated anything. Let's speak now to political analyst Musa Mdunge, who joins us via the virtual platform. Mr. Mdunge, good evening to you. Thank you very much for your time. Pro-hunting interests aside, let's park that on the side for a moment and talk about what could be at play here within the Democratic Alliance. What is not contained in that introduction, based on media reports that we have been reading, it is that Dr. Dion could potentially be moved to that position of deputy minister that was left vacant by Andrew Whitfield, which is in the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. If that ultimately becomes the reality, that would amount to a demotion, because you don't go from a full minister to a deputy. So, is there faction fighting in the Democratic Alliance?
Good evening, Toli, and good evening to the viewers. You know, certainly it does appear that way when one considers the fact that the party next year obviously must elect new leaders, and John Steenhuisen's own position is not certain at this point. But also, you know, given the fact that constitutionally, deputy ministers, as much as they are appointed by the president, they really serve at the pleasure of their minister. And it is the minister who determines the length and breadth in which a deputy minister can act within that portfolio. And so, of course, you know, strategically, is it key for the Democratic Alliance to fill that post of deputy minister in a key portfolio such as trade and industry, given the waters that we are in currently with what's happening in the United States? That becomes a key role. I wouldn't have seen it go to any other party than it being filled from someone from the Democratic Alliance. But certainly this shift, this swap that is proposed by Steenhuisen, of course, has also the wildlife lobbies who have a role and an influence in terms of the Democratic Alliance position and policy in terms of the wildlife economy, where the Democratic Alliance probably have called for a sustainable use model, where they're promoting wildlife economy as a conservation tool, arguing that ranching prevents land degradation and incentivizes biodiversity protection. That is the argument Steenhuisen would lay. So he would say that this is more than infighting, that it really sits at the heart of policy, but I would argue it's both.
Willie Aucamp, again, we make reference to the media reports that say he appears to be an old face in that particular space, and therefore he would almost fit in like a perfect glove within that community. What is it about him that makes him sellable to that community? And what is it about Dion that simply stands in the way of this hunting economy that John Steenhuisen wants to revive?
Well, look, you know, Aucamp, the key sort of differentiator between the two is that he is a fellow rancher. He is part of that industry. And so in many ways, it is an industry that he's quite familiar with. And therefore, in terms of the so-called policy paralysis that Steenhuisen, you know, seems to promote, it is one way in which to deal with that. And the argument, of course, that Steenhuisen and the DA will make at this point is that, look, gaming injects about close to 15.4 billion rand annually into the South African economy, depending on which reports you read, and is supporting thousands of jobs in Limpopo, Northwest, and Free State. And the argument perhaps that the DA would make is that, look, the South African economy has got to move beyond Gauteng, beyond Western Cape, beyond KZN, and other provinces have also got to be leveraged for the economic value that they have. And there is an economic argument here for why Aucamp is being pushed here. But on the other side is the argument against him that is being made by certain organizations calling for an urgent meeting of the president, saying that this move would actually be a reversal of so many gains that South Africa has made on the very issue of biodiversity and conservation and the leadership practically that South Africa plays in this role globally.
I may be looking at this naively, but I'll put the question to you anyway. Does this suggest that Willie Aucamp, if he ultimately is taken to that position, he would champion this, this hunting industry almost single-handedly? Where would you put the tourism minister? Because I want to think that this is a tourism space, if anything.
I would argue, Toli, that it is perhaps a space for both, right? And perhaps you're quite correct. Maybe as a possible solution, there needs to be a more defined sort of which minister, which portfolio is in charge of this. And so certainly one gets a sense that there is little or no conversation that is happening within government in order to ensure that there is no policy paralysis, no policy contradictions, and that everybody is singing from the same hymn book. Because if one were just to look at empirical data here, Toli, the median revenue per hectare that wildlife ranching brings to the economy is actually about $404 versus livestock farming, which is about $113. So it's also interesting to bring the element of agriculture here, Toli. I would argue that there are three departments actually linked to this thing. It is agriculture, it is then, of course, environmental affairs, and of course, then it is the Department of Tourism. But one would need to see greater policy cohesion from these three in terms of this matter, balancing the fact that on the one hand, you have thousands of jobs that are supported by this particular sector, and on the other hand, you have the need for South Africa, according to Section 24, which is what the NCPA is raising here, that the government has a constitutional obligation to protect the environment, and part of it is the protection of wildlife. That is a constitutional argument that they are bringing on this case, and it will be interesting to see how the president balances these two seemingly contradicting interest points.
Finally, you invoke the president, and we are talking about this as if it is going to happen, or perhaps it's waiting in the wings. If it does happen, would the president simply be taking the suggestion from the Democratic Alliance to say, Mr. President, this is John talking to him, Mr. President, I'd like a swap out. So swap Dion George with Willie Aucamp. Aucamp takes George's position right now, and you take George to that deputy minister position. Or might we look at a broader cabinet reshuffle? There is a minister deep in trouble within the president's administration right now, and there's another one from the African National Congress. He hasn't been charged, but he has lost in court. I'm sure you pretty much know who I'm talking about now in terms of trying to review the Zondo Commission findings. I'm talking about Gwede Mantashe. Do we think that we are going to see just a simple swap out, or might the president institute or mount a cabinet reshuffle?
Well, I would argue, Tony, that it's likely to be the second. The second, why? Because of the optics that would hide what would have been a DA directive to the president in how he uses fundamentally what are his constitutional powers to appoint both ministers and deputy ministers, and hiding the greater scheme of a president that is seemingly taking action. There's been complaint in not only the body politic, but I would argue in terms of the public, of a president that seems stuck and unable to make decisions, unable to effect change. And I think given the president's political position at this moment and the position of his party, it is likely that the second option is likely to be undertaken, and this will be hidden under that. And in many ways, that is likely where we are going. But probably to make another point, this is a space and an opportunity for South Africa as a whole to revisit whether the constitution is really geared for the moment South Africa is in, and truly recognizes that we are no longer in a political system where one party dominates, and that truly this political system has got to be representative of the shared powers and responsibilities of other parties. And so the question then is, should the power of appointment be exclusively in the hands of the president, given he no longer leads a party that has a majority? These are constitutional questions, but I would argue also strategic and policy questions that we need to answer in order to ensure that South Africa works better for all.
Musa Mdunge, thank you very much for your time and analysis tonight. He is a political analyst, giving us somewhat of an insight into the goings-on, not only in the administration led by President Ramaphosa, but also the intricacies inside the Democratic Alliance.